Welcome back to our channel. In 1990, as the United States inched its way out of a turbulent economic decade and the Berlin Wall crumbled on the other side of the world, life in America moved forward with subtle, unnoticed shifts. Factories whirred, families drove minivans, and the U.S. Mint continued its steady production of coins that most people never looked at twice. Among those coins, the Washington quarter, a coin so familiar it passed from hand to hand without a second thought, bore the iconic profile of George Washington with a polished precision developed over decades. Billions of them had been minted since 1932, each one a symbol of daily commerce, a quiet part of the American rhythm. The 1990 Washington quarter was no different at first glance. It featured the traditional obverse design, Washington's stern yet noble countenance, and the familiar reverse, the proud heraldic eagle with outstretched wings. It was struck in copper nickel clad at both the Philadelphia and Denver mints. For most, it was simply another coin, another 25 cents tossed into a vending machine or dropped into a child's piggy bank. But in the shadows of the minting process, something unusual occurred. Not immediately visible, not loudly proclaimed. A whisper of an error, born of mechanical oversight, hovered inside a small fraction of the 1990 mint output. The kind of mistake that no one expected. The kind of detail that would one day change everything. It didn't begin with a seasoned numismatist or a dealer hunting value. It started with a retired Navy machinist named Carl Dempsey, who had taken up coin collecting to fill his quiet afternoons. He liked the tactile nature of coins, the stories they held in their wear. One morning, while flipping through a new box of circulated quarters from the bank, his routine hunt for silver, his fingers paused on one piece. Not because of its luster, not because of any dramatic damage, but because something felt off. Carl tilted the coin under the light. The usual inscriptions were present. Liberty, in God we trust, and the date 1990 neatly tucked beneath Washington's profile. But his brow furrowed. There was no mint mark. No P for Philadelphia, no D for Denver. Just empty space. He brought out his loupe, scanned it again, and checked his reference guide. The Philadelphia Mint had begun regularly placing mint marks on quarters starting in 1980. By 1990, every quarter was supposed to bear one. Every single one. And yet this coin didn't dot at first. He wondered if the mark had been rubbed off, smoothed away by decades of friction. But the rest of the detail was sharp. The coin looked practically uncirculated. If it had seen any time in a pocket, it hadn't been long. The area where the mint mark should have been was not worn. It was clean, pristine, as if it had never been engraved in the first place. That realization struck Carl with a slow-building intensity. This wasn't post-mint damage. This was a minting anomaly. And the coin in his hand, humble, gleaming, and light as a feather, had just become something far more complex than change for a cup of coffee. He reached out to a local coin club, shared his find, and the reactions varied from curious skepticism to sudden excitement. As more eyes fell upon the coin, theories began to circulate. A filled die, perhaps a common error where dirt or grease prevents part of the design from appearing. But even then, such errors often leave a ghostly impression of the missing detail. This one? It was flawless in its absence. The blank space looked deliberate. The numismatic community began to murmur about similar finds. A handful of collectors in different states reported identical issues, 1990 quarters lacking mint marks, but otherwise perfectly struck. The number was low, far lower than any typical error batch. And that's when the momentum shifted. No longer was it a simple misstrike. This was a pattern, a vanishing detail that should have never been omitted, suggesting a deeper flaw in the production process. And with that pattern came questions and value. Initially, prices climbed cautiously. A coin dealer in Ohio offered $25 for one, citing mild interest and the novelty of the error. Weeks later, another collector posted one online and fetched $80 from a bidder who claimed to be building an air-only quarter set. But the true turning point came when a third-party grading service certified one of the no-mint mark 1990 quarters as an authentic error of origin, not post-mint damage, not a filled die, but a legitimate strike from a die that had not been properly punched with a mint mark. That distinction changed everything. Carl watched with amazement as his once ordinary quarter began to make headlines in coin magazines. The price doubled, then tripled. Auction houses began quietly reaching out, asking if any examples existed in higher mint state grades. An MS-65 specimen sold for over $300. A few months later, another fetched nearly $1,000. Still, no one could determine the exact number of these errors in circulation. Were there hundreds? Thousands? Tens of thousands? The uncertainty only fueled the fire. And then, the twist. In 1991, a former U.S. Mint employee who asked to remain anonymous contacted a numismatic journalist with an intriguing confession. During the final months of 1989, a batch of dies destined for Philadelphia had arrived without being punched with the P mint mark. It was standard practice to manually apply the mint mark to each working die at that time. But due to an internal personnel shift, at least 3 dies bypassed that station and were mistakenly installed for production. They struck coins for several days before anyone noticed the omission. By the time they were pulled, tens of thousands of quarters had already been shipped and mixed into general circulation. This wasn't an error born of grease or wear. This was human oversight, a procedural gap in an otherwise regimented process. And because the Philadelphia Mint struck over 613 million quarters in 1990, the presence of a few thousand no-mint mark pieces became nearly invisible among the masses. A ghost in plain sight. That context made the error both rare and traceable. Collectors now had the origin story. And with it came another surge in value. Carl's coin, once nestled among dull pocket change, was now encased in a protective slab, labeled with a grade MS-64 and a notation, 1990 no-mint mark verified die omission. He received an offer of $2,400 for it from a private buyer in Florida. He declined, not out of greed, but because the story had become personal. A journey that began with casual curiosity had bloomed into a treasure hunt that stretched from his living room to the inner workings of the Mint itself. But the story wasn't done yet. In late 1993, during a small coin expo in Oregon, a collector named Danielle Holt presented an unusual variant. Her 1990 quarter also lacked a mint mark, but something else caught her attention. The design appeared softer, the details less defined, as if the strike itself had been less forceful. Graders confirmed her suspicion. The coin had been struck by a deteriorating one, likely from the same no-mint mark batch, but used well beyond its optimal lifespan. That discovery cracked open a new layer to the mystery. Not only had no-mint mark quarters escaped into circulation, but they had been struck using aging dies, potentially identifying a specific window of hours, or even minutes, during which these errors were created. This revelation created a new subclassification among collectors. No-mint mark late die state. The premiums rose again. Some sought only the earliest strikes sharp and bold, while others chased the late-stage versions for their unique appearance. Auction prices soared. One early die strike reached $5,500 in a competitive online bidding war. A late die strike, once considered inferior, went for nearly the same amount due to its increasing rarity. The U.S. Mint eventually acknowledged the error in a quiet press release, referring to it as a regrettable oversight, with minimal impact on total production. But the numismatic world knew better. It was the kind of accident that transformed a routine minting year into a legend. And every time a new example emerged, collectors leaned in, measured the detail, checked the die state, and wondered, was this one of the first? Or one of the last? Carl, now a quiet icon in local collector circles, often told his story not with grandeur, but with a reverent calm. He still kept the coin, not in a bank vault, but in a velvet-lined case on his desk. He said it reminded him that even in the most ordinary things, routine, repetitive, unnoticed, there could be moments of pure accident that reshaped everything. He never looked at a quarter the same way again, and across the country, more collectors joined the silent hunt. Every 1990 quarter pulled from change received a second glance. Under magnifying glasses, in garage workshops, and at coin shows, fingers traced that small space under Washington's neck, waiting for a gap that didn't belong, waiting for silence where there should have been a mark, waiting, perhaps, for a second chance at a piece of history hidden in plain sight. In 2022, amid a nation adjusting to post-pandemic rhythms and rapid technological shifts, something as seemingly mundane as a coin might have been the last thing anyone paid attention to. Yet, as industries digitized and transactions moved to the cloud, the U.S. Mint quietly pressed forward with tradition, stamping millions of quarters into existence. This time, however, the quarter bore a new face, a powerful shift from the long-standing image of George Washington. It was part of the American Women Quarters program, a series designed to honor trailblazing figures in American history. The 2022 run featured 5 women, including the celebrated poet and activist Maya Angelou. The design was different. On the obverse, Washington remained, but his profile now faced right instead of left, modeled after Laura Garden Fraser's original 1931 design. It was bold, distinct, and deliberate. On the reverse, Angelou stretched her arms toward the sun, a dynamic representation of hope and resilience. The new design captured attention just not for the reasons that would soon ripple through the numismatic world. Coin collectors were quick to grab rolls of these new quarters. Fresh, modern, and historic, they were an instant hit. But tucked away in the regular distribution channels circulated bags, vending machine change, bank boxes. There were whispers. A pattern was emerging. Not in the subject matter, not in the artistic design, but in the way some of these quarters looked unfinished. Something didn't sit right. It was a college student in New Hampshire named Jules Morales, who first held one of these quarters and paused. They had been collecting casually since childhood, a hobby passed down from a grandfather. Jules was flipping through a new roll from their local bank when a Maya Angelou quarter caught their eye. At first, it was the brilliance of the reverse. The rays behind Angelou seemed deeper, more defined. But as they turned the coin to the obverse, they froze. There was a strange distortion near Washington's lower jaw, a swelling of metal. At first glance, it resembled a chip or damage, but the edges were smooth, natural, mint-made. Jules pulled out a second loop, examined the coin again, and compared it to others. The swelling was distinct. The flaw hadn't been caused by circulation or environmental damage. It had been struck into the coin. It wasn't alone. Another from the same roll had a similar anomaly, this time near the rim, where the inscription seemed slightly doubled and fuzzy. Jules began documenting each error, cataloging them, and reaching out to online forums. The floodgates opened. Other collectors had seen similar issues: ghostly outlines around Washington's head, doubling of letters, die chips forming odd growths on Angelou's wings, and even coins that appeared off-center or slightly misaligned. But the most baffling and eventually most valuable error came from a small handful of quarters found in circulation in Texas. These coins, upon first inspection, looked normal. But beneath magnification, they revealed a razor-thin vertical line through the center of the obverse. A die break. These die breaks, commonly called strike-through errors, occurred when something interfered with the minting press, debris, grease, or cracked die surfaces. In this case, it appeared the mint had used worn dies in certain press runs, resulting in quarters with this fine but visible break, slicing through Washington's portrait like a scar. It was subtle but unmistakable and rare. What made the situation more compelling was that some of these errors appeared on uncirculated coins. Mint state quarters straight from fresh rolls bore signs of these flaws. Collectors theorize that the rush to meet production deadlines for the new quarter program may have led to quality control being briefly compromised. With over 300 million Maya Angelou quarters minted across Philadelphia and Denver, even a small percentage of errors could yield a fascinating subset. As the months rolled on, the market responded. Jules's discovery gained traction, and the coin community began naming the die break the Angelou line. Online auctions sprang up. One error quarter sold for $45, then $80. Another example, with a more pronounced break and additional reverse doubling, drew $220 from a bidder in Nevada. Word spread fast. Grading services took notice. By the end of 2022, PCGS had certified over 24 2022 Maya Angelou quarters with documented errors. The highest graded example, a near-perfect MS-67 with a dramatic die chip and faint doubling on the obverse, was appraised at over $1,500. Another, with a complete strike-through line and reverse misalignment, sold privately $4,200. And then came the surprise no one expected. A collector in Maryland submitted a Maya Angelou quarter to be graded after noticing a peculiar texture along the edge. What came back was unprecedented. A Maya Angelou quarter struck on a planchet intended for a nickel. It was a wrong planchet error, stunningly rare. The coin was lighter, smaller, and the design was slightly cut off at the edges due to the size mismatch. This was not a mechanical mistake. It was a full-blown minting anomaly, one that shouldn't exist. Only a few dozen such errors have occurred in modern mint history. The coin was certified and dubbed 2022 quarter on nickel planchet Maya Angelou series. Within days, private offers exceeded $5,000. Weeks later, it sold at a public auction for an astonishing $8,700. Jules watched from a distance, still holding on to their original error coin, the one with the faint break, the swelling near the jaw, and the subtle doubling. They'd had multiple offers, but none tempting enough to part with it. To them, the quarter represented more than just value. It was a glimpse into the soul of modern minting, still fallible, still unpredictable, still full of hidden stories. Today, collectors still scour change, still search new rolls, still peer through magnifiers hoping for that next imperfect masterpiece. Because in 2022, among the millions of coins created to honor American women and reshape the face of currency, a few bore mistakes that turned ordinary quarters into objects of obsession, and the most pristine 2022 era quarter, graded MS-67, with a full die crack and clear planchet anomaly, holds its throne in the numismatic world, valued at $9,200 and rising.